In this video we're going to put a web front end and a database back end to our App03 the Student Grades example. Now I've kept this relatively simple compared to the version you did in CO452 in that we have three arrays, an array for student names, an array for student marks, but we don't actually have a student class in this example. We could have had a student class, but I was focusing on introducing the use of arrays, because in CO452 we didn't make much use of arrays. So we have a string array and an int array for the marks. You will find that all these are properties already public because we needed them public for unit testing, and we need them public for putting our web front end on as well. Now just for testing purposes, there were some students here, but I'm going to do those again in the constructor, and I haven't finished the console part of this, which was to display a menu to the user, ask the user to enter marks and output a list of marks. I haven't finished those, but we don't need those, we can do those in the web front end. But otherwise the other methods are public. We've got a public method to convert a mark into a grade, and we've got a public method for calculating the stats, and a public method for calculating the grade profile. The first thing we're going to do in our web apps, in our models folder, is to add a student class. So add a class called Student.cs, and we're going to give that student three properties. The name, which is required for App03, and the mark, which is required for App03. But because we'll be saving our data in a database this time, for the first time, databases, every record in a database requires a unique identifier. So typically that's an int, and it has the same name as the class with ID after it. That's a naming convention you must follow, or you don't. There is a way around it, but the whole system works automatically if you follow this convention, that the unique identifier, or the primary key for this, which will turn into a database table, is the name of the class with ID after it. But I've added what are called annotations using the component model data annotations again. We don't need the other usings, so that the names will be restricted to 20 characters, and a name is required, can't be left blank. And we've got a mark which will be in the range of 0 to 100, so there's some data validation put on easily using data annotations rather than having to write code. That's one of the strengths of ASP.NET. These data annotations really save an awful lot of time in validating data. So there's our student model we've added to our models folder. I put a link to this tutorial in the wiki App03 page, as it's a key tutorial in guiding you how to use MVC, ASP.NET MVC, with the entity framework, which is used for converting C# classes to SQL database tables. Be careful on the version, there's lots of versions. I'm using version 5. You should be using version 5. And if you scroll down, you can see they're doing a much more complicated database than we require. They've got students, courses, instructors. We're just going to have students, but the principle's the same. You create your ASP.NET project in the way I've shown you before. You modify the layout page in the way I've shown you before. And then you get your data model, and as I say, we're only going to have the student as the data model. Our student entity is also rather simpler than this one, but the principles are the same. So we're following this, and again we've got grades, so it's similar in that sense. Okay, but we're moving on now to create the database context class. because you've added registrations and login when you selected and created your project, you will already have a database context class. That'll be in the data folder here. It's called an application DbContext. And it's empty at the moment. But what we need to add are all the database tables. So they're going to be public. They're going to be using dbset, and we want a dbset of students. So remember, that is the student class. We will need to use it from our models folder. And it's going to create a database table with multiple students in. So the obvious name for this is students. In my view, database tables should have plural names because they contain multiple entities, multiple records. And then we're going to use the usual get and set methods. So there's our database context class. The next thing we're going to check is that we have the database context has been registered. There is a startup class here called startup.cs. And if you look in here, there it is, look. Add default identity, add entity framework with the application DbContext. Because we asked for logins and registrations, we already have our application DbContext registered. The next thing we're going to check is the name of the database itself. Now that's in our appsettings.json. So Microsoft have switched to using the JSON file format for putting in some of their configurations, and in particularly this thing called a connection string, which connects the C# project to a SQL Server database. We're using a SQL Server database here, but it could be other databases are available. And you can see by default the database name is going to be ASP.NET-Web Apps and this unique identifier. Now we don't need it to be quite as complicated as that. I'm going to take out this unique identifier and just give us a simpler identifier, 2021-2, as this is the second time I've done this. So I've shortened the database name, so the database name is going to be ASP.NET Web Apps 2021-2. If you scroll down the tutorial, one of the next stages is to add test data, and you can see you can add students and courses and enrollments and so on. But I'm going to skip this, try to keep it simple for you. But the one thing we must do is ensure the database is created, so that line of code is crucial. The next thing we have to do is to modify the program class, and these yellow sections have to be copied and pasted. So I'll take this one first in the main static main program. So instead of that one method, one line of code there, we're pasting these 3 lines of code here. So we need these 2 lines of usings. Actually, we don't need the Contoso University one because we will copy that dependency injection. Dependency injection is another design pattern. Okay, then go back to the tutorial. Copy this whole method, this create database if it doesn't exist method. Okay, so that compilation error is gone now, but we've got two others. First is that we haven't got a school context. We have an application DbContext, so this needs to be changed to application DbContext. Now I won't be able to find that without a using, so I'm hoping it's going to prompt me. Yes, we need the web apps data folder there. Okay, so it's found that. Okay, the next thing we want, right, we haven't got a database initializer. I'm not going to bother with that, so I'm going to take that line out. But I will put in place is that one line which was in the tutorial about ensuring a database is created. It's that line there, look. I'm going to copy that and put that in. Yeah, where we are there. Okay, now I think that's compiling. We don't need some of these usings. It should build. So here, when we move on to this section, creating controller and views, is where the real magic happens. So we have created our model, we've annotated our model, we've configured our database, and we're now ready to set up our controller and views. So I can right click on our controllers. We've only got a home controller at the moment. We're going to right click on that and add a controller. This is going to be a controller using the entity framework. The entity framework is Microsoft's ORM framework, Object Relational Modeling, turning C# code into database models. So that's the one we're using. And the model class, well, we've only got one. Oh, I thought we only had one model class. There's our student model. And there's our database context class. It's going to generate the views. I don't know which script libraries we're talking about. We could reference our script libraries. It will automatically use our layout page if we leave that blank. By default, it's going to be called a student's controller. No need to change that name. We now have a controller for students, and also if you look in the views, we have student views, views which list all the students, views to edit a student, views to look at the details of a student, to delete a student and create new students. They're all set up ready to add data to the database. So if we run it, right, I haven't linked it yet to this App03, I don't think, no, I haven't. But we haven't got a link to it yet. But in fact, because it's using the student's controller, we can say students, and it goes there, okay? It goes to the student's index page, and that can allow us to create a new student. Let's give the student a nice mark. Okay, so putting in a name for the student. Actually, let me just take the name out again and try it without a name. You should see, yep, name is required. And I can't give Hassan more than 100 marks. Let's see if we try to give him 1009. Oh dear, no, can't do that. So we've got our data validation on there and our error messages, which I think is an amazing amount of code that's been saved there, and we can create that student, and there is that student, and we can edit that student and say, oh dear, I made a mistake there, sorry Hassan, you've only got 88. We can edit. We can see the details of that student, although they're not very exciting, and we could delete the student, but I won't, because I'm going to add more students. So I think that is really amazing amount of code you've been saved writing. We'll just now tart it up a bit. One of the great strengths of Visual Studio is it does have built-in tools for database work. So I've actually opened the SQL Server Object Explorer, which you can get at from all these views. There's endless views here. So this is the SQL Server Object Explorer. Here's our local database, SQL Server. If we open that, you'll see exactly how many databases I've been using in the past few years. The database we have just created should be in here now somewhere. It started with ASP.NET. Started with ASP.NET and it went under Web Apps 2021-2. So it's this database here. So I open that out, you can see it has now tables. A lot of the tables are to do with users logging in and their roles. This is for security purposes. The one table we wanted is this one here. We can open it out, see the columns. So nvarchar is equivalent to a string in C#. We've got an int for the marks. We've got an int which can't be null for the student ID. You've got a primary key for the students. That's all been created for you. And you can, if you want, view the data. We should find one student with an ID of 1. Not very exciting. And we can also look at the design of the database table. And it writes the SQL. There's the SQL needed to create that database table. And you can modify the design using this design view. However, typically I wouldn't do that. I would use what are called database migrations instead, which means we change the code and the code changes the database without having to use any SQL. It writes the SQL and runs the SQL for you, essentially. Anyway, there we are. You can see databases are really essential for adding a dynamic aspect to websites so that the content of the web pages keeps changing and updating. Anyway, let's move on to improving the appearance of our web pages. First of all, I'm going to link them in. If we go back to our index page, our home index page, we had this link and it was to the home controller. I'm going to change that because we've now got a students controller. It was to a student marks page. I'm going to change that. I'm going to call that go to the index page. And let's just see if that now works. So can I go to App03 now? Yes, I can. So let's now improve the appearance of this web page. So what I've done to the web page is put a Jumbotron text center header with headings. I've changed this from a link to a button by adding a button class here. I've changed these down here to buttons rather than links, again using a button class. editing is success, info for details, and danger for delete. I've also added a number of students. Their marks bear no relationship to their real marks. Please don't be offended. Your mark isn't as high as you'd like. Okay, they're just arbitrary marks. So I've added some students. You can see it looks much neater. Change this a bit and we're ready to move on to the next page. I've now added one more button which will take us to a web page to analyse the grades. That doesn't exist yet. Oh, it's gone to student grade. Okay, my fault there. Didn't change, did I? So the action is going to be analyse. Okay, let's start with copying and pasting. So we're going to go to the analyse action, which doesn't yet exist in the student's controller. Okay, so here's the student's controller. I'm going to take out. Am I going to take out anything? No, I'm not. It's all right. I'm going to add something. So I'm going to add an analyse method. Now we want the list of students, so it'll be something like this. So I'm going to call it Analyse. At the moment, the view is taking in a list of students, and that's not what we want. So we do need our list of students. So I'm going to get those as a list from the database. So we have our list of students. I'm now going to make use of the Student Marks app. Don't know why it's not finding that, but let's add our using up here. So we're going to be using our console app project and App03. No, I don't know, it's student grades, not student marks, that's right. Sorry. That's better. So we better call this grades then. Okay, that's better. Okay, then we're going to create a new array of students, which are strings. The student list has a count, tell you how many students there are, and also we need the same, an integer array for the marks, again the same length. So that creates two new arrays. Okay, and now I've gone round a for each loop, taking each student from the list of students and passing the name into the grades student array and the grades mark array, and then moving the index on. Let's see if that works, shall we, before we go to the view. Okay, so let's have a look at our students array. There are 7 strings there. Yep, they look okay. And then let's look at our marks array. We've got the marks as well, so we're ready now for the view. So we need to pass this grades object to the view. We can now create our view. So right click, add a view. So raise a view. It's on Analyse. It's going to be empty. It's a shame we can't add the class there, but we can't. So let's just add that. So it's scaffolding now. It's called scaffolding. It's writing some scaffold code for you to do. It's not very simple in this case. We haven't even got a model. Now for a model we do want our student marks. So we want our console app project, App03, and we want the student grades as the model. That's going to be our model. I've forgotten the word model, haven't I? Sorry. There we go. There's our model. We may want other things. Let's stop there for the moment. What I've forgotten to do is, having got our student names and our marks into the student grades object, we haven't actually calculated anything yet. So we do need to call on the calculate methods. So we've got a calculate stats method and a calculate grade profile method. So let's do the calculation so we have our results ready for display in the view now. Okay, I'm just going to show you the code for the view. The header is fairly straightforward. And first of all we'll have two tables. So the first table, I like bordered and hover, but that's just improving the look of it. Essentially it's going to display how many students are in the group, what their minimum mark is, what their maximum mark is, and what their mean mark is. And that's straightforward because the model, i.e. the student grades object, contains an array of students, and we can use the length property to tell us how many students are in the array. And we've called on the calculate method, so there will be a minimum, a maximum and a mean, which we can just display from the model. And then the second section is another table. This is the grade profile, same kind of table, and here we've got the headings. I've centered them this time, and to get each of the number of students who've got each of the marks, we'll use a for each loop going round everyone in the grade profile. And then here's where we do the calculation. We're inside a piece of C# here. So it does seamlessly switch between C# and HTML. So there's HTML, switch to C#, do a calculation there, dividing the count by the number of marks. Now here, because the number of marks is an integer and count is an integer, and we want it as a percent, which is a double, I've had to cast it to a double. And then to get it with only one decimal place, I've printed out the percent as a string. So you can see here we are in HTML, here we are in C#, here we're back to HTML. I glossed over one thing in the student's controller you haven't seen before, the use of var. var stands for variable. If you can't work out what kind of thing you're going to get, you can just make it a var, and the system will work it out what it actually is. It is a list. What kind of list, we don't know, but it doesn't matter. We can still go through each of the students in that list. Okay, so we're ready to try this new view now. And there we go, we find out that there are 7 students in my list. Minimum mark was 44, maximum is 88. Oh, the mean we haven't displayed the mean in a very sensible way, have we? But we have got our percentages out quite nicely. So let me just cure that last remaining problem about the mean mark in the view. So again, mean is a double, so we can convert it to a string, and then we can format that string in the same way as we did the other, which I think is just 0.0. That means there will be at least one place before the decimal place. If there are more, it will display more. But if there are more after the decimal place, it will only display the first. And there we go, we've got a mean mark of 70.7. I suppose we could have put percent signs on these as well, but it's up to you. I'll stop there, I think. So what we've done there now is use the Student Grades class as a model for an MVC web application. And we've used the web side as essentially the view of that data. So we can see it in a mobile phone form, and also it does mean that we can run on any platform now.